Hi, I am Liisa Veerus. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at Rutgers University. My background is in biology and zoology, and I'm currently working on microbiome research. I was born during the, so to speak, baby boom era in Estonia, which was immediately after the collapse of Soviet Union. Coming from Estonia, our school education puts a lot of emphasis on learning different languages. Because we're such a small country and no one else speaks Estonian, so within my school system, I had to study Estonian, then English, then Russian, so those were the three compulsory languages, and then you had the opportunity to pick another language, and for me that was French. So, by the end of high school, I had some language skills for each of them, but obviously I felt most comfortable in English. So I felt I was relatively prepared to move abroad. Got my bachelor's degree from Imperial College and then started my PhD or D.Phil in zoology at Oxford University. It is easier to thrive there if you are British, if you're male, if you're white, and if you come from a rich family. And if you're not some of that or any of that, you will struggle. Maybe not on purpose. Obviously, the PIs are also international, but the system for sure favors a certain type of an academic. I felt like after my graduation from Oxford that it was time to move somewhere else. And my current boss, I met him during a summer school, and he's American, working at Rutgers University, and he really showed me what type of supervision could be. And now I've been with him for almost 2 years, and I enjoy being a postdoc much more than I enjoy being a PhD. And now, having lived abroad for, actually I calculated 10 years, I think I feel much more confident being abroad.
What do you think have been your greatest challenges as a postdoc and as a scholar coming from, a different cultural context?
I think the biggest challenge to this day for me in America as a postdoc are two things. First, even though I've been here almost for 2 years, almost every day I still get a bit of a culture shock about one thing or another. It could be a minor shock or a major shock, but many things are, it's different to what I'm used to. Many laws, without going into detail, many laws in Europe are, withstanding centuries, and they're not going to change. And obviously there are some laws that we need to broaden, and we have, because it makes sense. We're trying to become more inclusive. Unfortunately, I'm not necessarily seeing it everywhere in the States. And for me, personally, it's important to live in a country or a state or a territory that aligns with my values. And I do feel that sometimes my values, luckily not in New Jersey, but in a way in the States at large, are being challenged. So the culture shock part is one thing. And another thing is, and they tie in very tightly, my first language is Estonian, but both in the UK and in the US, in some instances, my English language is passing as if I was native, or at least I had lived in that country for a very long time. And I know that I'm perceived as a white woman in America, so oftentimes either my colleagues or, people in the street would project onto me what they believe the white American woman to be, for example, and make assumptions about me.
And how have you, let's say, managed to overcome these difficulties? In more or less what you were mentioning about some of the cultural barriers that you have faced because of your own, difference or coming from a different cultural background, and also these things that you mentioned, right? That about how the perceived positionality in the eyes of others here in the U.S., you being a white woman.
Yeah, so with culture shocks, luckily, if you're in an academic institution, it's more on the average to have also liberal colleagues. So you can discuss politics with them, you can discuss some activism if you're interested with them. So there's ways to you know, reside in a bubble, in a liberal bubble, but also try and maybe extend that bubble by being an activist. In terms of perceived identity, I have now started like disclosing earlier that, you know, I'm international and you know, I am queer. So people, I get the signal about who I am and then maybe think twice before they say something that they may regret.
I wonder if you, I don't know, perhaps can elaborate on how you think, right, this type of barriers that you face, and how do you relate to the barriers that are faced by people who come from other cultural backgrounds, for instance, black women, right?
Yeah.
Or people who don't have the language skills that you have, right? And how do you manage, or how do you think about this?
Yeah, it's a
right?
very good question.
Yeah.
I mean, in many ways, I'm very privileged. You know, walking on the street, if I don't open my mouth, people will have a perception about me, and I'm definitely, you know, safer than many other people. You know, that's a huge privilege. Having, you know, almost no language barrier, huge privilege in academia, you know, in writing, presentation, all of those things. You know, I'm not saying I didn't work for it. I mean, obviously, you know, I work for it, it's my second language. But, you know, not everyone was lucky enough to have a school system where they really start teaching you languages when you're 5 years old, which it makes the difference. That makes the difference in you developing the correct accent and the vocabulary and everything. So in those ways, I'm very privileged. But in many ways, I think Estonians and other ex-Soviet Union occupied countries feel kind of like the underdog in Europe. And that's why I definitely, in the States, sympathize and empathize with people who are the diversity, so to speak, in America. Because I think their lived experience, or the bullying, or the perception, is more similar to what, you know, I grew up with than me being more similar to white Americans. We're similar in skin tone, but I'm actually, in terms of upbringing and obstacles within Europe, more similar to the diversity of the States.
To the experience of minorities.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So for that reason, I feel very passionately about being an activist, particularly because I'm in this unique position that, you know, I am a white woman in America. My language skills are good, but I sympathize and empathize more with the minorities, right? So I will do everything and anything in my power to be a good ally, to be a good member to the communities I come from. And I mean, that's part of the reason why I immediately, when they mentioned that my center is getting a diversity committee, I knew I had to be on it. I knew I had to be an active member. I'm chair of one of the committees. We're putting on a lot of diversity and equity and inclusion and accessibility events and trainings and workshops. So I see my role in America as, okay, if they perceive me in a way, why don't I use it to my advantage and actually be a good ally to the others? Because for me, that's what's kind of become a mission in addition to my research in America.
Wow. Talk to me a little bit about some of the administrative or institutional challenges that you have faced as a postdoc.
I think what a lot of American citizens don't realize is that it's actually very difficult to arrive to America. And I did that also during COVID, when they had suspended many of the visa types, and, you know, getting to the embassy also in Estonia was incredibly difficult because they kept postponing and canceling my meeting because of the COVID status. So it took a long time for me to even get to the interview and then to get the visa and arrive here. And I had not traveled to the States before I arrived here to work. And it was my first time coming to America. They asked me all of these questions on the border, and then they said, oh, you're a microbiologist, you work with bacteria. Okay, we need to detain you because you may be carrying samples. And, you know, that was my welcome to America. So I was in this room without windows, and I was waiting to be interviewed. And they, you know, they were asking questions about my research, and I, you know, they were explaining to me that in the past they've had people or like scientists who have tried to come over the border with samples. Obviously, they didn't have any samples with me, but it was a very scary moment for me because I had arrived. They took my passport, they took my phone, they took my wallet. Like I didn't have anything. I'm in this windowless room with other people who had also been detained, and to put it bluntly, were of certain nationalities, were of certain race. When I was explaining this to Americans, they were like shocked, but then they kind of moved on. That's been my experience here. I explained something that like, oh, this happened, and I've never had this happen to me before, and like, is this normal? And for a moment, they seem shocked, but then they kind of move on. So I'm wondering whether it's become so normalized that these things are happening, or it's so outside of their own experience that they don't know how to relate. But that's a dangerous position to be in. You need to be able to relate to other people and put yourself in their shoes.
And what's next for you?
What's next for me? I will continue to be a postdoc for quite some time, because that's usually how it works in the STEM field. You need some years to establish yourself, and yeah, we'll take it from there. I'm trying to take it a week at a time, and obviously, have some plans for the future, but take opportunities as they come. Because as we know in academia, there are many opportunities around us, and we do apply for them, and the norm is rejection, but you never know, right? You can get an opportunity next week that is amazing and take you down a completely different path, or either maybe career-wise or research-wise. So I'm excited to see where it goes, but I'm fairly certain it's gonna contain parts research, parts policy, and obviously parts DIA. Those are close to my heart.
Part